A nation once proud to be the symbol of freedom, where people declared that all beings are created equal before the Creator, would one day sink into smoke, fire, and blood. In less than a century after the Declaration of Independence, America, the young nation once admired by the world for its spirit of liberty, had been torn into two opposing halves. Those who were once brothers, who once raised the flag of victory together in the war for independence, now pointed their guns at each other. The American Civil War was not merely a conflict over territory or political power, but a battle for the soul of a nation, where the greatest question was asked: would America truly be the land of freedom or remain bound in the chains of slavery? In 1861, the first cannon roared at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. It was the sound that marked the beginning of 4 bloody years, where hundreds of thousands fell on once green fields, where the cries of mothers who lost their sons blended with the smoke of war. Amid that chaos stood Abraham Lincoln, deep in thought in the White House, his eyes heavy and his face worn, carrying the fate of an entire people on his shoulders. For him, this was not only a battle to preserve the Union, but a test to see whether this young democracy could endure when faced with division from within. In the South, white cotton fields stretched to the horizon, but beneath that peaceful surface lay lives in chains, the calloused hands of millions of black slaves collapsing under the burning sun. They had no right to speak, no right to dream, and were treated as goods to be bought and sold. Meanwhile, the North was booming with industry as factories, railroads, and ports sprang up everywhere, fueled by a vision of a free, equal, and progressive America. These two opposing worlds coexisted within one nation until they could no longer reconcile. The flames of war were kindled not only by economic differences, but by conflicts of morality, human rights, and the very future of America. One side clung to the past with its system of slavery, while the other reached toward a future of freedom and human dignity. And so blood was spilled, not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts of millions of Americans. That Civil War, in the end, was a painful but necessary purification. It was the cry of justice in the darkness, the price a nation had to pay to find itself again. And in those flames, America was reborn, no longer a nation of masters and the enslaved, but a place where all people, no matter their color, could dream of freedom. In the mid-19th century, the United States seemed to be entering its most glorious era since its founding. Iron trains ran across vast lands, factories rose throughout the North, and endless white cotton fields stretched across the South. But behind that prosperous picture was a silent crack that was spreading wider and wider, a crack between two worlds coexisting in one nation. One world of machines, industry, and freedom. Another world of farms, slavery, and obedience. When America was born in 1776, the Founding Fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. But from the very beginning, that statement was tested by cruel reality. Millions of Africans were kidnapped, chained, and forced onto ships across the Atlantic, sold like goods in southern slave markets. They toiled under the burning sun, planting cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco to sustain the Southern economy, while being denied the right to be called human. The North, with its rapid industrialization, soon realized that slavery was not only inhumane, but also a barrier to national progress. The South, relying entirely on slave labor to maintain its wealth, viewed the system as a natural part of society. Gradually, the two regions no longer shared a common vision of America. The biggest question at that time was no longer whether slavery was right or wrong, but whether America could exist with two opposing systems within the same nation. Every time a new state joined the Union, the country plunged into political crisis. Fierce debates erupted. Will this new state allow slavery or not? In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was enacted in an attempt to preserve the fragile balance. Missouri was allowed to have slaves, while Maine became a free state. But that was only a temporary solution. The fire of discontent still smoldered.
By the mid-19th century, it had burst into flames. The 1850s saw America fall into deep moral and political crisis. In Kansas, people shed blood to decide whether their land would be free or slave. It was called Bleeding Kansas. In 1857, the Dred Scott case shocked the entire nation. A slave sued for his freedom after being taken by his master to a free territory. But the Supreme Court declared that black people were not citizens of the United States and had no right to sue. That verdict poured fuel on the flames of outrage in the North, where people saw it as a betrayal of the ideals of freedom their ancestors had fought to secure. Then, in 1859, John Brown, a fanatical white abolitionist, led an armed attack on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry with the goal of sparking a slave uprising. The plan failed, Brown was hanged, but his death shook the nation. To the North, he was a martyr for freedom. To the South, he was a terrorist. The divide had become irreparable. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, America seemed to be walking on a knife's edge. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, was seen as the representative of the North's belief, opposing the expansion of slavery. When Lincoln won the election without a single Southern vote, it was like a slap in the face to Southern leaders. They believed the new government would destroy their way of life. Just months later, Southern states began seceding from the United States one by one. South Carolina was the first, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, until a total of 11 states broke away, forming the Confederate States of America. They chose Jefferson Davis as president and established their capital in Richmond, Virginia. In the North, Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States, faced the heaviest task in the nation's history: to keep America from falling apart. He understood that if the seceding states succeeded, the United States, a nation born from the ideal of liberty and equality, would become nothing more than a broken dream. In his inaugural address, Lincoln said, "We are not enemies, but friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But that plea could not stop the storm that was coming. On April 12, 1861, before dawn's light touched Charleston Harbor, the first Confederate cannons thundered toward Fort Sumter, where Union troops were stationed. From that moment, American history turned a bloody page. The Civil War had begun, and no one could have imagined it would last 4 years, claim more than 620,000 lives, and reshape the destiny of an entire nation. It was not only a war between two regions, but a war between two ideals. One side believed that freedom must belong to all people. The other believed that freedom was reserved for the few born to rule. And in that very conflict, America paid in blood to rediscover its true soul. The first gunfire echoed at Fort Sumter on an April morning in 1861. That sound shattered the peaceful air of America, marking the beginning of the bloodiest war in the nation's history. Smoke rose from the cannons, red flames reflected on the waters of Charleston Harbor, and from that moment, America was no longer a united nation. Two regions, two ideals, two opposing paths of development had officially collided. The North, called the Union, entered the war with the goal of preserving national unity. Under the leadership of President Abraham Lincoln, they believed that America could not exist if it were divided in two. Lincoln once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." To him, this was not merely a political conflict, but a battle to protect the soul of a young democracy. Meanwhile, the South, the Confederacy of seceded states, fought with the belief that they were defending their right to self-determination, their right to preserve a way of life built on a slave-based economy. For Southerners, the federal government was interfering with the freedom of the individual states, and thus they took up arms to defend their freedom, even though that freedom was built on the enslavement of millions of black people. The war began with the South's confidence. In the first months, Confederate forces won a series of victories, especially at the Battle of Bull Run in Virginia. Fire and smoke engulfed the fields, drums pounded, shouts echoed, and horses thundered across the land. The Southern people believed that with just a few decisive battles, they could force the North to accept the Confederacy's independence. But the North did not yield easily. With nearly twice the population and far greater industrial power, they possessed the immense resources needed for a prolonged war. Northern factories produced millions of rifles, hundreds of locomotives, and thousands of tons of ammunition and food every month. Meanwhile, the South, dependent on agriculture, saw its economy quickly collapse under a naval blockade. Another crucial factor was the railway system. The North had a dense network of railroads, allowing them to move troops and supplies rapidly between battlefronts. The South, by contrast, lacked infrastructure, had few trains, and relied on dirt roads. This made transporting supplies, moving the wounded, and deploying troops extremely difficult. Yet, throughout 1861 and 1862, the South astonished the world. Under brilliant commanders like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Confederate forces won resounding victories. At Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, they pushed back the Union Army with heavy losses. The image of Southern soldiers in gray coats and wide-brimmed hats fighting through clouds of gunpowder smoke became a symbol of the Confederacy's fierce spirit. However, each Southern victory came at a bloody cost. Their numbers were smaller, their resources limited, and as the war dragged on, exhaustion began to show. Meanwhile, the North grew stronger, fueled by industry and abundant finances. President Lincoln understood that to win, he needed not only an army, but the will of the entire nation. He launched policies to inspire people to believe in the ideal of one united and free America. In major cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, newspapers constantly published articles boosting morale. Rallies were held where citizens donated money, food, and letters of encouragement to soldiers at the front. On the battlefield, soldiers from both sides faced harsh conditions never before seen. They fought in mud, through freezing winters and scorching southern summers. Disease, hunger, and homesickness tormented them. Thousands did not die from bullets, but from typhoid, malaria, and infection. The world watched America in astonishment. Many European nations, especially Britain and France, considered recognizing the Confederate South, as its cotton exports were vital to their textile industries. But they hesitated, for the war was increasingly seen not just a territorial conflict, but a struggle between two opposing ideals, freedom and slavery. Inside the White House, Abraham Lincoln wrestled with sleepless nights. He looked out the window where heavy winter rain fell over Washington and understood that this was not merely a war to preserve the Union, but a chance for America to redefine itself. Could a nation born in liberty endure half slave and half free? Or must it be reborn through pain to become greater? As blood was shed across the battlefields of Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, and Mississippi, Lincoln prepared for the boldest step of his life, a decision that would forever change the course of American history: the Emancipation Proclamation. But before that document came to life, America was still drowning in blood. The screams, farewell letters, and nameless graves scattered across the South were proof of the price the nation had to pay for its division. Throughout the first 2 years of the war, both sides believed ultimate victory would be theirs. But as time passed, it became clear that this was no short conflict. It was a brutal test of faith, will, and morality for an entire people. And from within that sea of fire, a new America was slowly being born. One where freedom was no longer a slogan, but an ideal to be defended with blood and tears.
In 1863, when the Civil War had entered its third year, America was almost drowning in despair. Blood had been spilled from the southern fields to the hills of Pennsylvania. The Union and the Confederacy were locked in a deadlock. Each day, thousands of soldiers fell, and the entire nation sank into the darkness of division.
Yet, amid that storm, President Abraham Lincoln remained steadfast in his belief that America must be united and that freedom must be the foundation of that unity. Lincoln was a man who deeply understood human suffering. Born into poverty, he taught himself to read by the light of an oil lamp and always believed that all people deserved to live as human beings. When war broke out, he did not only seek to preserve the Union, but to redefine the meaning of freedom itself. However, during the first 2 years of the war, Lincoln remained cautious. He knew that if he declared emancipation too early, the border states like Kentucky and Missouri might join the South. So he waited for the right moment, a victory big enough to make the Declaration a symbol of strength, not of desperation. That moment came in mid-1862, after the brutal victory at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties. Though not a perfect victory, it gave the North its first strategic advantage. And just 3 days after that battle, Abraham Lincoln did something the world would never forget. On September 22, 1862, he issued a preliminary proclamation. If the Southern states did not end their rebellion before the first day of the new year, all slaves in those regions would be set free. It was not just a political threat, but the first ray of freedom for millions who had lived in chains. Then, on the morning of January 1, 1863, as the winter sun rose over Washington, Lincoln put his pen to paper and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He told a close friend, "I never felt more certain that I was doing right." The document was brief, yet its power would change the course of history. It declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. As the news spread across Southern plantations, enslaved people lifted their heads and looked northward with a hope they had never known. Many fled, following the call of freedom, joining the Union Army. More than 180,000 black men donned the blue uniform, fighting for Lincoln's cause. They were not only fighting to free themselves, but to prove that they deserved the rights of human beings. From that moment, the Civil War was no longer merely a conflict of politics or power. It became a moral struggle between freedom and oppression, between light and darkness. Lincoln had transformed the war to preserve the Union into a war to liberate humanity. And that transformation changed the way the entire world viewed America. However, the proclamation did not instantly end slavery. It applied only to the rebellious territories, meaning that in many places, slaves were not yet truly free. But spiritually, it marked an irreversible turning point. Once Americans had redefined freedom, nothing could drive them back into the old shadows. The Emancipation Proclamation also gave the war international significance. European nations, which had hesitated to recognize the Confederacy, now had to stand with the North, for they could not support a government built on slavery. From that point, Lincoln gained not only the upper hand on the battlefield, but also on the diplomatic stage. In the days that followed, Lincoln often repeated a simple but profound truth. A nation conceived in liberty cannot exist half slave and half free. It was his declaration that America must choose one path, either freedom or disintegration. And then, even as the smoke of war still lingered, a new faith began to stir in the hearts of millions of Americans. They understood that though the war was far from over, its direction had changed. America was no longer merely to preserve the Union, but to prove to all humanity that freedom is a sacred right that can never be denied. The Emancipation Proclamation became an eternal symbol of faith and human dignity. It not only opened the door for millions of slaves to step into the light, but also opened the door for America itself to enter a new era, an era where freedom was no longer just words in the Declaration of Independence, but a living reality written in blood, tears, and the courage of an entire nation.
In 1863, America was shrouded in the darkness of war. Blood had been shed for 2 years. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost, and no one could predict which side would win. The North, despite its advantages in industry and manpower, was losing morale after painful defeats at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. The South, under the brilliant command of General Robert E. Lee, grew more confident with every battle, believing that God was on their side. But history always turns on moments no one can foresee. In the summer of 1863, the war reached a life-or-death turning point. Two major campaigns erupted almost simultaneously at opposite ends of the country. One in the West, where General Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to the strategic city of Vicksburg on the banks of the Mississippi River, and one in the East, where two massive armies were about to clash in a quiet little town called Gettysburg in the state of Pennsylvania. In the West, Grant, the Union's steadfast general, understood that control of the Mississippi River was the key to splitting the South in two. After months of siege, during which the Confederate forces were completely cut off from supplies and the townspeople were starving to the point of eating horses and dogs, on July 4, 1863, Confederate General John Pemberton was forced to surrender. The entire Mississippi River fell into Union hands, dividing the South in half. The victory at Vicksburg was not only a military triumph, but a devastating blow to the very heart of the Confederacy. Meanwhile, in the East, General Lee advanced into Northern Territory with 75,000 men. He hoped that a resounding victory would turn Northern public opinion against the war and force Lincoln to negotiate peace. But fate led him to Gettysburg, the site of the bloodiest battle in American history. On July 1st, the two sides accidentally collided in the rolling hills of the small town. The skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale battle. For 3 days, cannon fire thundered, gun smoke filled the air, and the ground of Gettysburg shook with the screams of tens of thousands of soldiers. The Confederate Army launched wave after wave of assaults, trying to break the Union lines. But the Northern troops under the command of General George Meade held firm on every inch of ground. On July 3rd, General Lee made a desperate gamble. He ordered a massive frontal assault on the enemy center. Over 12,000 Confederate soldiers in General George Pickett's division marched across an open field under a storm of cannon and rifle fire. As they neared the Union lines, thousands of bullets tore through their ranks, turning the field into a sea of blood. In less than an hour, more than half of Pickett's men were killed or wounded. The attack failed disastrously. Lee was forced to retreat. The Battle of Gettysburg was over, and the North had won. Both sides suffered over 50,000 casualties, a horrifying number that shocked the entire nation. From that moment, the balance of the war tipped in favor of the Union. The South lost its final chance to invade the North, and from then on could only fight defensively. In November 1863, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to attend the dedication ceremony for the soldiers who had fallen. Standing on the field where tens of thousands had died, he delivered a speech lasting just over 2 minutes, but its echo would last forever in human history. He said that those who had fallen did not die in vain, that this war was being fought to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's words left the crowd in silence. In that moment, America seemed to finally grasp the true meaning of the war. It was no longer a struggle between two regions, but a test of whether freedom could survive in a nation that had once accepted slavery. After Gettysburg, Lincoln found renewed faith that the blood paid by hundreds of thousands would not be meaningless. And General Grant, with his victory at Vicksburg, was chosen to command the entire Union Army. Two men, one with intellect and conviction, the other with strength and determination, would together write the final chapter of the Civil War. The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg were the turning points of American history. They marked the moment when America began to rise from the ashes and when freedom finally had a chance to triumph over the darkness of slavery.
In the smoke and fire of those days, a new America was being born. Not divided by color or boundary, but united by the will to live, the belief in justice, and the value of human dignity. In 1864, as the war entered its fourth year, both sides were exhausted. The country lay in ruins, the once fertile fields now reduced to ashes, and hundreds of thousands of families had lost their loved ones. But while the South was beginning to weaken due to dwindling manpower and supplies, the North, under the steadfast leadership of President Abraham Lincoln, had found the man who could end the war, General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was not a dashing gentleman like Robert E. Lee, nor was he famous for brilliant tactics. He was a practical, cold, and determined man. He believed there was only one way to end the war: strike hard, strike continuously, and leave the enemy with no strength to resist. Grant's strategy of total war was not only about defeating enemy armies on the battlefield, but about destroying the South's infrastructure, supply lines, and will to fight. In the summer of 1864, Grant launched the Overland Campaign against Robert E. Lee in Virginia. Two generals, two symbols of two nations, faced each other in a series of bloody battles: Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Each battle was a nightmare. Bodies piled up, the ground soaked with blood and mud. Grant refused to retreat despite the heavy losses. He said a cold but unforgettable line: "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." While Grant pressed Lee in the east, in the south, another Union general was carrying out a campaign of unprecedented devastation: William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman understood that to force the South to surrender, he had to break not only its armies, but also the spirit of its people. In November 1864, he began his March to the Sea. Sherman led more than 60,000 soldiers from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, a march of more than 300 miles. They burned granaries, destroyed railroads, torched factories, seized armories, and wrecked everything that could sustain the Confederate war effort. Towns went up in flames, bridges collapsed, and streams of refugees crowded the roads. Thousands of enslaved people were freed along the way, following the army with newfound hope that freedom was near. Sherman wrote in his diary, "War is hell. But if this hell can bring the war to an end sooner, I will walk through it without hesitation." His march left a massive scar across the South, but it was also the path to peace. While Sherman moved toward the sea, Grant continued his siege of Lee at Petersburg. For nearly 10 months, the two armies fought for every inch of ground. The Confederate troops starved, their ammunition ran out, while Grant's forces were constantly resupplied from the north. By early 1865, Lee's situation was hopeless. On April 2nd, Grant launched a final assault. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, fell. A week later, on April 9, 1865, in the small home of Wilmer McLean at Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee, in a clean and elegant uniform, met with Grant. They sat in silence for a long moment. Grant, in his dusty, battle-worn coat, showed no arrogance. He spoke calmly. "You and your men may return home. Keep your horses for the spring planting. We need a united country, not more blood." Lee bowed his head and signed the surrender. Outside, soldiers from both sides stood in silence. There were no cheers of victory, only tears, from both the defeated and the victors. The American Civil War had officially ended, after 4 years of bloodshed. When the news of victory spread across the North, church bells rang and flags were raised in every city. Yet the joy was mixed with undescribable grief. More than 620,000 lives had been lost, a number greater than the total American casualties in both world wars combined. Mothers, wives, and sons would never return home. The nation was reunited, but every household still mourned. Abraham Lincoln stepped onto the White House balcony, gazing at the crimson sunset. He knew this victory belonged not just to the army, but to freedom itself. America had survived its greatest trial, and from the ashes of war, a new nation was reborn, stronger, braver, and more united than ever before. The war had ended, but the wounds had not yet healed. Still, in that moment, the entire nation shared a sacred feeling. They had upheld the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Freedom at last had prevailed.
Washington, D.C., the evening of April 14, 1865. The city was enveloped in a rare moment of peace after 4 years of bloody civil war. The American flag fluttered atop the buildings. Lights shimmered on the surface of the Potomac River. People flooded the streets, singing, dancing, celebrating victory. The war was over. Robert E. Lee had surrendered. The Union was reunited. And inside the White House, President Abraham Lincoln sat quietly by the window, his distant gaze fixed on the blooming garden outside. He had just endured the most brutal months of his life, bearing the fate of an entire divided nation on his shoulders. Tonight, he planned to go to the theater with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, as a way to momentarily forget the pain and the burden. Around 8:30 p.m., the president's carriage stopped in front of Ford's Theater. Lincoln entered with a smile, waving to the audience. The entire hall stood and applauded thunderously as America's hero appeared. The play was titled Our American Cousin, a light-hearted comedy full of laughter. No one knew that within minutes, tragedy would strike right there. In the shadows of the corridor behind the stage, a man watched silently. His name was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor of the time, and a fanatic supporter of the South. Booth believed that assassinating Lincoln would avenge the South and restore white dominance. He had planned his act meticulously for days, and now the fateful moment had arrived. Around 10:30 p.m., Booth quietly slipped through a small door leading into the president's box. Lincoln was smiling, eyes fixed on the stage. Booth drew a .41 caliber Derringer pistol, aimed at the back of the president's head, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed sharply through the theater. A bullet pierced Abraham Lincoln's skull. He collapsed into the frantic arms of his wife. Screams erupted throughout the theater. The crowd was in chaos, many unable to believe their eyes. Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, stabbed a soldier who tried to stop him, and shouted loudly, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He then fled on horseback into the dark night, leaving behind a nation engulfed in horror. Lincoln was carried to a small house across the street from the theater, laid on a narrow bed in a cramped room. Doctors rushed to save him, but it was hopeless. The bullet was lodged deep in his brain. He lay there, his breathing growing faint, his face calm as if asleep. All night long, cabinet members, generals, and close friends stood vigil. Mary wept uncontrollably, calling her husband's name in despair. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. Outside, the dawn had just broken. The soldier standing guard by his bed choked out the words, "Now he belongs to the ages." All of America sank into mourning. Church bells rang from Washington to New York, from Chicago to San Francisco. Millions wept. They had not only lost a president, but the very soul of the nation, a man who had borne the pain of division to reunite his country. News of the assassination spread like wildfire. John Wilkes Booth was hunted everywhere. 12 days later, he was found hiding in a barn in Virginia. When he refused to surrender, Booth was shot dead. But that bullet could not erase the sorrow he had caused. Lincoln's funeral procession lasted more than 2 weeks. His coffin was carried through 7 states and 180 cities so that the people could say their final goodbye. Hundreds of thousands stood in the rain, waiting hours just to see him one last time. Along every street, flags were lowered and mournful songs echoed through tears. People in the North called him the father of freedom, while those in the South gradually came to see him as a symbol of humanity and forgiveness. The entire world bowed in respect to the man who had ended the chains of millions of slaves. The death of Abraham Lincoln was not just the end of a man's life,
but the closing of a tragic chapter in American history. Yet, his legacy is eternal. Lincoln laid the foundation for a united, democratic, and free America. He believed that compassion was stronger than hatred, and that unity was the only path to healing a wounded nation. Since then, Lincoln's image has become a symbol of faith and justice. His seated statue in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., still reminds every generation that freedom is never free, and the price of peace is sometimes the lives of the greatest among us. The morning light that streamed through the small window where he took his last breath seemed to carry a promise. America would live on, and the ideals for which Lincoln gave his life, equality, liberty, and unity, would endure.
The Civil War had ended, but the echoes of cannon fire still lingered in the minds of millions of Americans. When the smoke cleared, America was no longer the same. The nation was unified, but the wounds remained deep in the heart of the people. Each field that once grew crops had become a graveyard for the sons of America, both North and South. The soldiers who survived returned not only with physical wounds, but also with deep emotional scars. They had fought against their own countrymen, their own brothers. The cost of victory was horrifying. More than 620,000 lives were lost. Millions were wounded, and countless families were torn apart. But from those ashes, a new America began to rise, a nation no longer divided, a land reborn in freedom. After the war ended, the country entered a period known as Reconstruction, a difficult yet hopeful era that lasted from 1865 to 1877. The federal government began a monumental task, rebuilding the South, which had been almost completely destroyed. Cities lay in ruins, the economy had collapsed, and the newly freed slaves had to learn how to live as true citizens. It was a task that required not just money and manpower, but compassion, forgiveness, and a vision for the future. Abraham Lincoln, who had once dreamed of malice toward none, with charity for all, was no longer there to lead the nation through its trials. His death was an immeasurable loss, leaving a great void in the process of national healing. Yet his spirit lived on in the great reforms that followed. 3 important amendments emerged during this period that forever changed the face of the United States. The 13th Amendment completely abolished slavery across the nation, ending a stain that had lasted for centuries. The 14th Amendment ensured that everyone born in the United States was a citizen and entitled to equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote, a monumental step in the history of human rights. However, the path to true equality was far from easy. Though slavery had been abolished, prejudice and racism were deeply rooted in society. In the South, many black people were stripped of their voting rights through harsh laws and discriminatory regulations. The Ku Klux Klan was born, spreading terror and hatred. Those who had once been slaves now faced a cruel reality. They were free, but still bound by invisible walls of injustice. Yet from within that darkness, light began to shine. Many Americans, both white and black, stood together to fight for justice. Schools for black children were established, human rights organizations emerged, and the dream of an equal America slowly took shape. These efforts laid the foundation for the civil rights movement nearly a century later, a movement that would be illuminated by names like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. The Civil War not only changed the laws, but also transformed how Americans saw themselves. Before 1861, many viewed the United States as a loose union of sovereign states. After 1865, people understood that America was one unified nation, sharing a common destiny, common ideals, and a shared belief in freedom. Lincoln once said that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And after the war, those words became the guiding principle of an entire nation. From the ruins of war, America entered a powerful era of industrialization. New railroads were built, modern cities rose, and the economy revived rapidly. The people, despite their pain, worked together to rebuild the nation, driven by the belief that unity was the foundation of the future.
But the greatest legacy of the Civil War did not lie in factories or constitutional amendments. It lived within the American soul, in the unyielding will, the belief in freedom, and the understanding that equality is not a gift, but something that must be fought for. When you stand before the statue of Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., in that grand marble hall, and gaze up at his contemplative face in the soft light, you can feel the weight of history. The Civil War took away so much, yet it gave something priceless in return: the true soul of America. A soul forged in suffering, bathed in blood, and illuminated by the fire of justice and human dignity. That is the eternal legacy of the Civil War, a legacy that reminds us freedom is never guaranteed, but always a journey of sacrifice to protect the truth and humanity of mankind.
When the morning light shines upon the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the soft golden rays gently touch the face of the great president, the man who preserved the unity of America with his very life. Every line on his face seems to carry both the pain and the hope of an entire nation. Standing in that silence, one can feel something holier than victory itself: the soul of America, a soul reborn from the very bloodshed of the Civil War. More than a century and a half has passed, yet the echoes of that war still live on in every book, every monument, and every oath sworn by the people of the United States. Each generation that looks back asks itself, did those who fell ever imagine an America like today? A nation where everyone, regardless of skin color or origin, has the chance to rise. A country still continuing its journey toward justice, knowing that true justice is never easily achieved. The Civil War did not only shape the political system of the United States, it shaped the American spirit itself. It taught them that freedom is not a gift from heaven, but the result of struggle, perseverance, and faith in unchanging values. From the pain of war, Americans learned the strength of unity. From loss, they learned the value of forgiveness. And from ruins, they learned how to rebuild trust. America after the Civil War was no longer a nation of separate states, but a unified whole, sharing one soul, one flag, and one ideal: freedom for all. That unity paved the way for the nation's later greatness, from industrialization and westward expansion to becoming a global superpower in the 20th century. But all glory began in sorrow, and the Civil War was the baptism through which America came of age. Today, when people walk through Arlington Cemetery, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers from both the North and the South rest, they can feel that reconciliation has truly taken root. There are no more borders of hatred, only rows of white headstones standing neatly beneath the blue sky, as a silent reminder that American blood once shed was not to divide, but to unite. If you look closely at the American flag flying above the White House, you'll see red stripes symbolizing blood and sacrifice, white stripes representing justice and purity, and blue stars standing for hope in the darkness. That very flag flew over the battlefields of Gettysburg, over the plains of Vicksburg, and still waves today, proof that freedom may be tested, but it will never be defeated. From the Civil War, Americans realized that democracy is not something permanent, but something that must be protected every day. Injustice, division, and conflict still exist in modern society, but the lesson of the 19th century still echoes: only unity, tolerance, and faith in humanity can move a nation forward. The Civil War also left humanity with a profound legacy: the belief that all people are born with the right to live free and equal. That idea transcended America's borders, spreading across the world and inspiring future movements for human rights. Every time an American stands before the Lincoln Memorial, they are not only remembering a president, but also the soul of millions who gave their lives to defend America's promise. That promise still beats in every citizen's heart: that freedom, equality, and justice are not just words, but responsibilities for every generation.
And if you are hearing these words, take a moment to reflect. The Civil War is not just a chapter in history books. It is a mirror reflecting who we are. People living in a modern world where freedom must still be protected, where justice must still be voiced, and where compassion remains the light that guides humanity forward. History is not just for remembering, but for learning, so that we understand that only by looking back at the past can humankind walk confidently into the future. If you love emotional stories of history, full of human lessons from events that shaped the world, leave a comment below. What do you think is the greatest lesson America learned from the Civil War? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to U.S. History, so you won't miss the next stories where every page of history comes alive through emotion, through people, and through the truth of time. Because history never dies. It's only waiting for us to tell it again.